I want you to stop for a moment and think about your life. Think about the struggles, the victories, the questions that keep you up at night. Now, let me ask you something. Is there anything more powerful than God's plan for you? The answer, my brothers and sisters, is this: no, not your doubts, not your past, not the obstacles in your path. Because when God sets a plan for your life, it is unstoppable. The problem is we don't always see it that way. We get caught up in the distractions, the setbacks, the rejections, and we start to wonder, is this all there is? But I'm here to remind you, God's plan is bigger than your circumstances. When God designed your life, he did it with purpose. He didn't make a mistake when he formed you in your mother's womb. He didn't stutter when he spoke your destiny into existence. His plan is not just good, it's perfect. It's a plan for you to prosper, to thrive, to make an impact in this world that no one else can make. But here's the truth: God's plan isn't always easy. It doesn't mean you won't face challenges. In fact, you will. You'll face doors that slam in your face. You'll face seasons where you feel like you're wandering through the wilderness with no way out. But even in those moments, God's plan is still working. Do you know why? Because every setback is a setup for your comeback. Every tear you cry waters the seeds of your future harvest. Every battle you face prepares you for the victory that's already yours. But here's the thing: you've got to trust him. You've got to surrender your timeline, your fears, your control. You've got to stop asking God to work on your terms and start letting him work on his. Because his plan isn't just about you, it's about the people you're called to bless, the lives you're destined to change, the legacy you're meant to leave. God's plan doesn't depend on your qualifications, it depends on his power. It doesn't rely on your perfection, it relies on his grace. It doesn't require you to understand it, it requires you to walk in faith. So I ask you again, is there anything more powerful than God's plan for you? No mountain is too high. No valley is too low. No enemy is too strong. When God says, this is your purpose, nothing in heaven or on earth can stop it. God's plan for your life is unstoppable and perfect, regardless of your circumstances. It doesn't matter what you're facing right now, what doors have closed, or how many times you've stumbled. When God has a plan for you, it will unfold in his time and in his way, no matter what. This is the unshakable truth that we often need to remind ourselves of when life doesn't go as planned. It's easy to forget when we're in the middle of struggles or when we're surrounded by confusion and uncertainty. But God's plan isn't subject to our understanding, our doubts, or our mistakes. It's bigger than all of that. When God speaks a plan into your life, it isn't a mere suggestion or a passing thought. It's a declaration of destiny. His plan for you is already set in motion, designed before you were even born. The moment you were formed in your mother's womb, God already knew what he had in store for you. Your life was crafted with purpose and intentionality. Nothing in your past, nothing in your present, and nothing in your future can change that divine purpose. However, when we experience setbacks, it's easy to believe that we're off track. We think that maybe God has forgotten about us, or maybe we've messed up so badly that we can't get back to where we were supposed to be. But that's not how it works. God's plan doesn't depend on our ability to get it right every time. It doesn't depend on our human limitations. It depends on his eternal will, his perfect timing, and his unwavering love for us. Even when we don't understand what's happening around us, God is working behind the scenes. He sees the bigger picture. He sees what we can't see. We may not always understand why certain things happen in our lives, why we face specific struggles, or why things seem to fall apart. But that doesn't mean his plan is broken or flawed. It means that his ways are higher than our ways, and his thoughts are higher than our thoughts. Consider the story of Joseph. His journey is a perfect example of how God's plan unfolds, regardless of what we see in the moment. Joseph was sold into slavery by his brothers, falsely accused of a crime he didn't commit, and thrown into prison. From a human perspective, Joseph's life looked like a series of devastating setbacks. But God was using every one of those circumstances to shape Joseph's character, prepare him for leadership, and position him for the moment when he would be able to save an entire nation. The plan was always in motion. Joseph just couldn't see it until later. In the same way, God's plan for your life is unfolding even when you don't have all the answers. His plan is not subject to your timing or your perspective. It is perfect in its design. There will be times in life when you feel like you've reached a dead end. You'll face situations where it feels like nothing is going the way it should, where the path ahead seems unclear or impossible. It's in these moments that we need to remind ourselves that God's plan doesn't fail. The plan is already set, and He will lead you through the darkness step by step. Trusting in God's plan means that we let go of our need to control the situation and surrender to His will. It means that we choose to believe, even when we don't understand, that God is working everything for our good. This doesn't mean that life will always be easy or free from pain. It doesn't mean that God will prevent every hardship from entering your life. In fact, sometimes God allows us to go through trials so that we can grow, so that we can become stronger in our faith, so that we can be better prepared for the next step in His plan. But even in those tough seasons, we can take comfort in knowing that God is still at work. Nothing happens outside of His control. He is always moving you toward the fulfillment of the plan He has for you. He's always using the circumstances, good or bad, to align you with your purpose. You may have moments where you feel like you're failing. You may look at your mistakes and think, there's no way I can be on the right track. But let me tell you, your mistakes do not disqualify you from God's plan. In fact, God often uses our failures to lead us into the fullness of His plan. He redeems our brokenness and uses it to bring about something beautiful. Think about King David. He made mistakes. He fell short in many ways, but God still used him to fulfill His purpose. God saw his heart and knew that despite his flaws, David was the one who would rise to the challenge. God can take your mistakes and use them for His glory, just as He did with David. He can redeem your past, no matter how dark it may seem, and use it to propel you into your future. Another important point is that God's plan for your life isn't limited by the world's limitations. It doesn't depend on the economy, the political landscape, or other external factors. These things can affect our daily lives, but they do not dictate God's ability to fulfill His purpose for you. When God has a plan for you, it's not going to be thwarted by what's happening around you. The plan is not bound by human systems or ideas. It transcends everything that the world might throw at you. What we need to focus on is the truth that God's plan is bigger than anything we can imagine. When you look at your life, you may see a series of events that don't seem to make sense. You may see a collection of struggles that seem pointless. But when you take a step back and allow God to open your eyes, you'll begin to see the intricate weaving of His plan. Everything you've gone through, every step you've taken, every turn you've made, it's all leading you to where He wants you to be. God's plan for you is unstoppable because it is rooted in His sovereignty. No matter what challenges come your way, His purpose will stand. No matter how many obstacles you face, they cannot prevent God from fulfilling His will for your life. His plan is perfect because it's guided by wisdom beyond our understanding, love that never fails, and power that can't be resisted. You may not see it today, but every step you take is part of the journey to the fulfillment of that plan. Your current situation is not the final chapter of your story. God is still writing it, and every twist and turn is part of His beautiful narrative. What you can hold on to in those times of uncertainty is this: God's plan is perfect. It is unstoppable, and it will come to fruition at the right time, in the right way, and for the right purpose. Every setback is a setup for a greater comeback. This statement holds within it the truth that life is not just about the obstacles we face, but how we respond to them. It's about understanding that every time we encounter a challenge, it's not the end of our journey. It's an opportunity to build something stronger, to grow deeper, and to position ourselves for something better than what we had before. When we face setbacks, whether they are personal, professional, or spiritual, it's easy to become disheartened. The natural response is often frustration, disappointment, or even fear. We look at the road ahead and all we see are walls, closed doors, or setbacks that seem to have no purpose. But in the midst of those difficulties, if we take a step back and look with the eyes of faith, we can see that these moments are not here to defeat us, they are here to propel us towards something greater. The idea that every setback is a setup speaks to the concept of divine timing. We often see setbacks as interruptions, but God sees them as part of a larger process. In the Bible, we see this principle illustrated in many different stories. Joseph's life, for example, is a powerful illustration of this truth. He was thrown into a pit by his own brothers, sold into slavery, and falsely accused of a crime he didn't commit, which ultimately led him to prison. From the outside, it looked like Joseph's life was spiraling into one setback after another, and yet each of these events was a critical step in preparing him for the destiny God had for him. Every moment of suffering, every unjust accusation, and every rejection was part of God's plan to position Joseph for his moment of greatness. God used those setbacks to set up Joseph for the position of authority he would eventually hold, a position from which he would save an entire nation. In the same way, we often face trials that seem unfair or overwhelming. We wonder why we are experiencing certain challenges, why things aren't going as planned. But if we trust God, we begin to understand that these setbacks are not obstacles to our destiny. They are the very things that are preparing us for what's next. They are shaping us, refining us, and building our character. The setbacks help us develop resilience, patience, and a deeper dependence on God. Take, for example, the experience of a runner in a race. When they encounter a setback, such as tripping or falling, it may seem like the race is over, but for those who get back up, that setback is a setup for greater perseverance and strength. They learn to push through pain, to overcome the temptation to quit, and to keep moving forward. In life, we can view setbacks in the same way as moments that push us to grow, to learn, and to ultimately emerge stronger than before. It's important to remember that setbacks do not define us. They may be painful or discouraging in the moment, but they do not determine the final outcome. What truly defines us is how we respond to those setbacks. Do we stay down when life knocks us over, or do we rise up with renewed strength, knowing that God has a greater purpose in mind? When we face challenges, it's easy to fall into the trap of thinking that our setbacks are punishment or that we've somehow fallen out of God's will, but this is where faith becomes crucial. Faith allows us to see beyond the immediate pain and disappointment and to trust that God is using the situation for our good. In Romans 8:28, it says, "And we know that in all things God works for the good of those who love him, who have been called according to his purpose." This means that even in the moments that seem like setbacks, God is still at work behind the scenes, orchestrating something greater for us. Our setbacks are not a sign of God's abandonment, but a part of his plan to position us for a better future. Sometimes our setbacks can feel like they are too much to handle. We may feel as though we have reached the end of our strength, the end of our ability to keep going. But this is when we have to remember that God's strength is made perfect in our weakness. When we are at our lowest, God is at his highest, and that is when he can do his greatest work in us. Our weakness becomes the place where his strength shines brightest. When we are brought to the end of ourselves, we are often brought to the beginning of something new, something better, something designed by God to take us to the next level. The process of growing through setbacks is not always immediate. Sometimes we don't see the benefits of what we've gone through until much later, sometimes years after the event has passed. But even in the waiting, even when we can't see the full picture, we must trust that God is working all things for our good. Trusting in his timing means knowing that there is a purpose behind every moment of hardship and that we are being equipped for the future he has prepared for us. In the natural world, we often see that things must first break down before they can be rebuilt. A seed must break open and die before a new plant can grow. The butterfly must first break free from its cocoon before it can take flight. The pressure of the earth turns coal into diamonds. Similarly, our setbacks are often the breaking points that allow something new to emerge in us. Through the pressure, the struggle, and the pain, God is refining us, making us into something more beautiful, more resilient, and more capable of fulfilling the purpose he has for us. In these moments, we have to remind ourselves that we are not victims of our circumstances. Instead, we are victors in Christ. Our setbacks are not the final word over our lives. We can choose to see them as setups, as divine opportunities for God to reveal more of his purpose and his power. The key is to keep moving forward, to keep trusting, and to keep believing that God is using every part of our journey, even the setbacks, to prepare us for something greater. We may not understand how, and we may not understand why, but if we trust in God's plan, we can be confident that every setback we face is merely a setup for a greater comeback. And when that comeback happens, we will look back and see how each moment of struggle was a necessary part of the process that led us to the breakthrough we were destined for all along. Trusting God's timing over our own understanding is one of the most profound lessons we can learn in our walk of faith. It challenges us to release control, to surrender our plans, and to accept that God knows what is best for us, even when it doesn't align with our personal timeline. We are often caught in the trap of wanting things to happen when we think they should, and we become frustrated, anxious, or disillusioned when things don't go according to our schedule. Yet God's timing is not only perfect, it's always better than what we could imagine for ourselves. One of the most difficult aspects of faith is the waiting. We are a generation conditioned to want things fast. We want answers quickly, solutions immediately, and success without delay. But God does not operate according to the pace of the world. His plan for our lives is far bigger, far more intricate than anything we could orchestrate on our own. And the process he takes us through is as important as the outcome. Sometimes we have to wait because God is shaping us, preparing us, and refining us for what he has ahead. In the waiting, he is doing more than we can see. Think of the story of Abraham, one of the most well-known examples in the Bible of trusting God's timing. God promised Abraham that he would be the father of many nations, but at the time, Abraham and his wife Sarah were childless and old, far beyond the age when having children seemed possible. God gave Abraham a promise, but the fulfillment of that promise did not come quickly or easily. In fact, it took years. Abraham and Sarah grew impatient. They tried to make things happen on their own, taking matters into their own hands, but God's plan could not be rushed. It was only when Abraham was 100 years old and Sarah was 90 that God's promise came to fruition. And when it did, it was beyond anything they could have imagined. God's timing was not just perfect, it was purposeful. He used those years of waiting to build Abraham's faith and to teach him the power of trusting in God's plan, even when it didn't make sense. God's timing is often different from ours because his view of time is eternal, while ours is limited to the here and now. We look at our situations through the lens of our immediate needs, but God sees the end from the beginning. He knows exactly what we need and when we need it. His timing is not just about when things happen, it's about how those things will unfold in our lives and in the lives of others around us. Sometimes the delay is not about us at all, but about positioning the right people, the right opportunities, and the right circumstances in place so that we can walk into the fullness of what God has prepared for us. We must remember that just because something doesn't happen right away, it doesn't mean God has forgotten about us or that he's not listening. It means he is preparing something far better than we can imagine. We see the waiting as a frustration, but God sees it as an opportunity for growth. The waiting period is a season of preparation. It's a time to strengthen our faith, to refine our character, and to learn to rely on him fully. The longer we wait, the more we learn to trust in his timing. Every moment of waiting, every delay is an invitation to grow deeper in our relationship with God, to learn to trust him even when we don't understand what's happening around us. It's easy to fall into the trap of comparison during the waiting season. We look at others who seem to be moving forward, receiving what they've prayed for, and we feel left behind or forgotten. We may even question why our dreams seem delayed while others seem to have theirs come true effortlessly. But we must remember that everyone's journey is different. God is working on each of us in unique ways. Just because someone else's timing is different doesn't diminish the significance of our own journey. It's a reminder that God's plan for our lives is specific to us, tailored to our strengths, our needs, and the greater purpose he has for us. The waiting is not a reflection of our worth. It is a part of the divine process that will ultimately lead us to the place where we are fully ready for what he has promised. There is also something about the waiting that cultivates patience, which is a fruit of the Spirit. The Bible teaches us that patience is necessary for spiritual maturity. James 1:3-4 says, because you know that the testing of your faith produces perseverance. Let perseverance finish its work so that you may be mature and complete, not lacking anything. Patience is not just about waiting, it's about learning to wait well with an attitude of trust and peace. In the waiting, God is molding us. He is teaching us to rely not on our own understanding or timing, but on his. He's showing us that he is in control and that his ways are higher than our ways. In our impatience, we may try to rush things, make decisions on our own, or push for what we want, but this often leads to frustration and mistakes. God's timing allows for the right doors to open at the right time, for the right people to cross our paths, and for the right opportunities to come our way. It's easy to want things now, but what we fail to see in our impatience is that rushing can lead to consequences that God is trying to prevent. His delay is not denial, it's protection. He is keeping us from making decisions that are not part of his plan or that would lead us into unnecessary hardship. He is guiding us toward the right future, and his timing is the perfect path. When we trust God's timing, we also allow ourselves to experience the joy that comes with his perfect provision. When the promise comes, when the doors open, when the breakthrough happens, it is sweeter because it has been done in God's perfect time. The waiting, though it may be hard, becomes a testimony of God's faithfulness. When we finally step into what we've been praying for, we will look back and see that everything was worth the wait. The character we developed, the lessons we learned, the relationships that were built during the waiting process, these things all contribute to the fullness of the blessing. And even when we don't see immediate results, trusting in God's timing allows us to rest in the peace that he is always at work, even when we can't see it. God is never idle. He is constantly working on our behalf, orchestrating the events of our lives in a way that will bring about his perfect plan. Trusting his timing means that we let go of anxiety, we let go of control, and we rest in the assurance that his plan will unfold exactly as it is meant to at the perfect time. God's timing is not just about the end result, it's about the journey. It's about how he refines us in the process and how we learn to trust him more deeply. When we choose to trust God's timing over our own understanding, we are choosing peace over worry, faith over fear, and obedience over control. And in doing so, we open ourselves up to experiencing the fullness of God's plan for our lives. God is never early and he is never late. He is always right on time. This statement might sound simple, but it holds within it a profound truth that can change the way we approach life's challenges, struggles, and seasons of uncertainty. It can be easy to think that God's timing is arbitrary or that he is somehow unaware of our needs, but nothing could be further from the truth. The reality is that God is deeply involved in every moment of our lives, and his timing is always perfect, even when we don't understand it. When we look at our own lives, we often have a timeline in mind. We set goals, make plans, and expect things to happen in a certain order. We envision how our lives will unfold, and we want those milestones to come at the right time. But often our expectations don't align with the timing of God. We experience delays, detours, and what feel like missed opportunities. We may find ourselves frustrated, questioning why things are not happening when we think they should. We may wonder if we've done something wrong or if God has forgotten about us, but the truth is God's timing is always intentional. His delays are not denials, they are part of the bigger picture he is creating for us. We can look to the story of Lazarus in the Bible to see this principle in action. When Lazarus, the brother of Mary and Martha, fell ill, his sisters sent word to Jesus, asking him to come quickly to heal their brother. They knew that Jesus had the power to heal, and they expected him to respond immediately. But instead of rushing to Lazarus' side, Jesus delayed his visit. He allowed Lazarus to die. This must have been confusing and painful for Mary and Martha. They had trusted Jesus, and yet he didn't come when they thought he would. It seemed like an untimely response, even a failure. But Jesus had a purpose in his delay. He wasn't being cruel or inattentive. He was waiting for the perfect moment to reveal his glory in a way that would deepen the faith of his followers and demonstrate his power over death itself. When he finally arrived, Lazarus had been in the tomb for 4 days. Yet Jesus called him out of the grave, and Lazarus was resurrected, bringing a powerful testimony of God's timing and power. This story teaches us that even when God appears to be silent or distant, he is never absent. His timing is always aligned with his perfect will. We may not understand the reasons for his delays, but we can trust that he is working things out for our good. In our human perspective, we often see only the immediate situation, and it can be hard to see the bigger picture. But God, who exists outside of time, sees the whole plan from beginning to end. He knows exactly what needs to happen and when it needs to happen. He is orchestrating every detail of our lives in a way that we might not fully comprehend, but that will ultimately result in his glory and our good. One of the most difficult aspects of trusting in God's timing is that it often requires patience. We live in a world where everything happens fast. We have instant access to information, immediate results from technology, and quick responses in almost every area of life. This fast-paced environment has conditioned us to expect things to happen quickly and to become frustrated when they don't. But God's ways are not like our ways. His timing is not bound by our cultural expectations of immediacy. Instead, his timing is deliberate and perfect. He knows exactly when the time is right for us to receive what he has for us. And he knows when we are ready to handle the blessings he has prepared. Patience is something that God often cultivates in us during seasons of waiting. When things don't happen according to our timeline, we are given the opportunity to learn to wait with trust and faith. Patience is not about simply waiting. It is about maintaining a positive and hopeful attitude while we wait. It is about learning to rest in the fact that God is in control and that he has a plan, even when we can't see it yet. Waiting on God's timing teaches us to surrender our own agendas and to rely fully on him. It develops our trust in his goodness, his wisdom, and his faithfulness. In the waiting, God is often working in ways that we cannot see. He is preparing us for what is ahead, teaching us valuable lessons and building our character. There are things that he needs to work out in us before he can trust us with the blessings he has for us. Sometimes the waiting is not about the external circumstances. It is about the internal transformation that God is doing in our hearts. He uses the time of waiting to refine us, to shape us, and to make us more like Christ. Consider the example of David, who was anointed to be king at a young age, but had to wait many years before actually stepping into the position. During those years, he faced challenges, battles, and even personal struggles. But those years of waiting were not wasted. They were preparing him to be the king that God had destined him to be. In those years of waiting, David learned humility, patience, and dependence on God. He was forged into the leader that Israel needed, and when the time was right, God elevated him to the throne. The story of David teaches us that waiting is not wasted time. God is always at work, even when it seems like nothing is happening. Every season of life, every delay, every detour, and every setback is part of the preparation for what God has for us. The waiting period is not just about a future promise. It is about the present process of becoming who God has created us to be. It is about building the strength, wisdom, and character that we will need to handle the blessings and responsibilities that lie ahead. Another key element of trusting God's timing is learning to release our expectations. We often have a specific idea of how we want things to unfold, and when they don't happen the way we imagined, it can be discouraging. But God's plans are always better than our own. His timing is not only perfect, it is filled with purpose. We may not understand why things are happening in a particular way, but if we trust that God's plan is good, we can rest in the assurance that his way is always the best way. God's timing is not about delaying our dreams or keeping us from what we want. It is about positioning us for the best possible outcome. His timing is always aligned with his love for us, and he knows exactly what we need and when we need it. Sometimes what we think we want may not be what is best for us in that moment. God's perfect timing ensures that we are ready to receive what He has for us and that we are prepared to steward it well. It's also important to remember that God's timing is not just about us, it is about the bigger picture. God is working in our lives, but He is also working in the lives of others. Sometimes His delays are part of a bigger plan that involves multiple people, circumstances, and events. We may not always see how our timing fits into the larger puzzle, but we can trust that God is at work behind the scenes, orchestrating everything for His glory and our good. Ultimately, trusting God's timing requires faith. It requires the belief that God is good, that He loves us, and that He knows what is best for us. It requires surrendering our own plans and expectations and trusting that He will bring about His will in His perfect time. When we learn to trust God's timing, we can experience peace in the waiting, knowing that He is always right on time. God's plan for our lives is always bigger than what we can see in the moment. It's often difficult to understand the purpose behind certain events, struggles, or delays, especially when they don't make sense from our perspective. But when we look back on our lives, we can often see how God's hand was at work in ways we couldn't have imagined at the time. He uses every experience, both good and bad, to shape us into the people He has called us to be, and ultimately to fulfill the purpose He has for us. Our understanding of His plan is limited, but God's vision is eternal, and He sees the big picture that we are often unable to see in the moment. We are often caught in the immediate circumstances of our lives. We look at what is happening right now, and it can feel overwhelming or discouraging. When we face challenges, disappointments, or setbacks, we may question why things are happening the way they are. We may wonder why we are going through what seems like a difficult or pointless season. But it is during these times that we must trust that God is at work, even when we cannot see the full picture. His plan for us is being unfolded step by step. And sometimes we have to walk through hard seasons in order to fully appreciate and understand the fullness of what God has for us. One of the most profound truths in the Bible is that God's plan for our lives is one of purpose and intention. Nothing happens by accident. God is always working behind the scenes, even when we don't understand what He's doing. There is a divine purpose to every season of our lives, and even in the darkest moments, God is using those experiences to shape us and prepare us for what is ahead. His purpose is far greater than our own, and He is constantly working to bring about His good plan for us, even when we don't see how it all fits together. We can look at the story of Joseph in the Bible to see this truth in action. Joseph's life was filled with hardship, rejection, and betrayal. He was sold into slavery by his brothers, wrongfully imprisoned, and left in situations that seemed hopeless. From the outside, it looked like his life was falling apart, but in reality, God was orchestrating every detail of his life for a greater purpose. Joseph's journey was filled with pain, but it was also filled with purpose. God used every trial, every setback, and every moment of hardship to prepare Joseph for the position he would one day hold as the second in command in Egypt. Through all of the difficulties Joseph faced, he remained faithful to God, and God used his life to save not only his family, but an entire nation. Joseph's story is a powerful reminder that our lives are not random and our struggles are not meaningless. God is using everything we go through to prepare us for the future He has planned. We may not always understand why certain things are happening, but we can trust that God is using them to fulfill His purpose in our lives. His plan is always greater than our own understanding, and He is always at work, even in the most difficult seasons. Sometimes we try to take control of our own lives and make things happen in our own timing. We think we know what's best for us, and we try to force our own plans to come to fruition. But the truth is that God's plan is always better than our own. He sees the end from the beginning, and He knows what we need when we need it. Our plans are limited by our understanding, but God's plan is eternal and perfect. His timing is always right, even when it doesn't line up with our own expectations. When we trust God's plan, we are acknowledging that He knows what's best for us and that His plan is far greater than anything we could imagine. We may not understand why things are happening the way they are, but we can trust that God is working everything together for our good. Even when we can't see the bigger picture, we can rest in the truth that God is in control and He is working all things together for our benefit. We also have to remember that God's plan for our lives often involves other people. We are not walking this journey alone. God has placed people in our lives to help us along the way, and sometimes the challenges we face are part of a greater plan that involves others. God uses our relationships, our interactions, and our circumstances to bring about His purpose in our lives. He uses other people to refine us, to teach us, and to help us grow. The people we encounter along the way are not random either. They are part of God's plan for us. Take, for example, the story of Esther. Esther was a young woman who was chosen to be queen, but her position was not just for her benefit. God placed her in that position so that she could save the Jewish people from destruction. Her story is a powerful reminder that God places us in specific situations and relationships for a purpose that is often beyond our understanding. Esther's obedience to God's plan ultimately led to the deliverance of an entire nation. And her story is a testimony of how God uses ordinary people to accomplish extraordinary things. Similarly, in our own lives, we may find ourselves in situations or relationships that don't make sense at first. We may feel like we're stuck in a difficult job, a challenging relationship, or a season of waiting. But God is using those circumstances to refine us and prepare us for something greater. He is working in and through those situations to bring about His purpose. We may not always see how it fits together, but we can trust that every detail of our lives is part of His plan. Trusting in God's plan also means surrendering our own desires and plans to Him. It means letting go of our need to control the outcome and allowing God to lead us in His way. Surrendering our plans is not always easy, but it is essential for experiencing the fullness of what God has for us. We may have dreams and goals for our lives, but God's dreams for us are always greater. When we surrender our will to His, we open ourselves up to the possibility of experiencing a life that is beyond anything we could have imagined on our own. It's important to remember that God's plan for our lives is not always linear. There may be detours, delays, and unexpected twists along the way. We may find ourselves facing struggles or setbacks that we didn't anticipate, but even in those moments, God is at work. He is using every part of our journey to shape us into the person He has called us to be. Our struggles are not in vain. They are part of the process of becoming who God has destined us to be. There may be times when we question why things are happening the way they are, but we can trust that God is using every moment, every situation, and every relationship to fulfill His purpose in our lives. We may not always understand the purpose behind our struggles, but we can trust that God is using them to shape us, refine us, and prepare us for what He has ahead. God's plan is always bigger than what we can see in the moment, and He is always working behind the scenes, orchestrating every detail of our lives for His glory and our good. God's guidance is something that we often seek, especially in times of uncertainty or when we're facing difficult decisions. The challenge, however, is that His guidance doesn't always come in the form we expect. We may hope for a clear, audible voice from heaven or a direct, unmistakable sign, but most of the time, God's guidance comes in more subtle ways. It comes through His Word, through our prayer life, and through the circumstances of life that He orchestrates. One of the key truths we must understand is that God is always speaking to us. The issue lies in our ability to hear Him and recognize how He is speaking. Sometimes we may feel disconnected, uncertain, or unsure of which direction to take, but if we trust God's guidance, we will see that He leads us in ways that are always for our good and His glory. The Bible tells us in Psalm 119:105 that God's word is a lamp to our feet and a light to our path. This verse beautifully captures the idea that God's guidance is like a light that illuminates our way. It doesn't necessarily shine a spotlight on the entire journey ahead, but it provides enough light for us to take the next step. When we seek God's guidance, it's often in the form of small steps rather than grand sweeping revelations. And each step we take in obedience to God's word brings us closer to the destination He has for us. This idea of taking small steps of faith can be seen in the life of Abraham. When God called Abraham to leave his home and go to a land that God would show him, Abraham didn't receive a detailed map of the journey or an exact timeline. He simply received the command to go and the promise that God would show him the way as he went. Abraham had to step out in faith, trusting that God would guide him every step of the way. His obedience to God's guidance, even without knowing all the details, is a model for us today. We don't always need to know the entire plan. What matters is taking the first step in obedience and trusting that God will continue to guide us as we move forward. In addition to guiding us through his word, God also speaks to us through the Holy Spirit. The Holy Spirit is our helper, our comforter, and our guide in life. He dwells within us and works in our hearts, guiding us, convicting us, and reminding us of God's truth. One of the primary ways that the Holy Spirit leads us is through the still small voice in our hearts, which often nudges us toward what is right and away from what is wrong. This guidance is often not loud or dramatic, but gentle, and it requires us to cultivate a sensitivity to his voice. The more we spend time in prayer, listening for the Holy Spirit's promptings, the more attuned we become to his guidance. God's guidance also often comes through the people around us. In the early church, the believers were constantly seeking God's guidance together. They prayed together, sought counsel from one another, and trusted God to speak through the wisdom and experiences of other believers. In Proverbs 15:22, it says, "Plans fail for lack of counsel, but with many advisors they succeed." This verse highlights the importance of seeking wisdom from others, especially those who are mature in their faith. God can use others to confirm his direction for our lives and to help us discern his will. Sometimes he will use a word of encouragement or a piece of advice from a trusted friend to give us clarity and direction. In our modern world, we often want immediate answers to our prayers, but God doesn't always work on our timeline. His guidance isn't always instant, and sometimes we have to wait for the right timing. Waiting for God's guidance can be one of the most challenging aspects of the Christian walk. We may want to make decisions quickly, but God often asks us to wait for his perfect timing. During this waiting period, God is working in us, teaching us patience and helping us to rely on him fully. He is not withholding guidance from us, but is preparing us to receive it in a way that will be most beneficial for us in the long run. Waiting on God is not passive, it is an active, trust-filled process. It requires us to trust that God knows the perfect timing for everything in our lives and that his guidance will come at the right moment. There will be times when we face uncertainty and feel unsure about the direction we should take. It's natural to want to have everything figured out, but we must learn to trust God's leadership, even when the path ahead isn't clear. It's in these moments of uncertainty that our faith is tested. God is teaching us to rely not on our own understanding, but on his wisdom and guidance. Proverbs 3:5-6 encourages us to trust in the Lord with all your heart and lean not on your own understanding. In all your ways submit to him, and he will make your path straight. This is a powerful reminder that even in times of uncertainty, we can trust that God will make our paths clear as we lean on him and seek his guidance. Another way that God guides us is through the circumstances of our lives. Sometimes he will open doors that we never expected and close doors that we may have wanted to pursue. In these moments, we must learn to recognize God's hand at work and trust that he is guiding us through the situations we face. We might not always understand why certain doors are closed, but we can trust that God is guiding us to where he wants us to be. Sometimes the closed doors are just as significant as the open ones. They prevent us from going down paths that may not be in line with God's will for our lives. We can trust that his guidance is always for our protection and his purpose. There is also a significant role in prayer when it comes to hearing God's guidance. Prayer is not just about asking God for things, it's about building a relationship with him and listening for his voice. In prayer, we have the opportunity to seek God's will, ask for his guidance, and listen for his answers. This requires us to slow down and spend time in God's presence, quieting our hearts and minds so that we can hear what he is saying to us. Prayer is where we align our hearts with God's will and submit our plans to his perfect guidance. When we make prayer a priority, we position ourselves to hear from God and receive the direction we need. One of the most powerful ways that God guides us is through peace. The peace of God acts as a kind of spiritual compass, guiding us in the right direction. When we are making decisions, if we have God's peace about a choice, it is often a sign that we are in alignment with His will. On the other hand, if we feel unrest or anxiety about a decision, it may be an indication that we need to pause and seek God further. Colossians 3:15 says, "Let the peace of Christ rule in your hearts." When we allow God's peace to rule our hearts, we can be confident that we are being led in the right direction. Ultimately, God's guidance is a constant, ongoing process. He is always with us, always speaking to us, and always leading us. The challenge is in staying connected to Him, cultivating sensitivity to His voice, and trusting that His guidance is always for our good. Even when we don't have all the answers, we can have peace knowing that God is leading us step by step toward His perfect plan for our lives. Trusting in God's timing is one of the most difficult aspects of the Christian journey. As humans, we tend to want things to happen quickly, according to our own timelines, and in a way that fits our expectations. We want results now, answers now, and blessings now. But God's timing is often very different from ours. He doesn't work according to our schedules, and He doesn't operate on our timeline. His ways are higher than our ways, and His thoughts are higher than our thoughts. This is something we must learn to accept if we are to fully experience the fullness of God's plan for our lives. Trusting in God's timing requires surrender, patience, and faith that He knows exactly what He's doing, even when we don't understand why things are happening the way they are. One of the key truths about God's timing is that it is always perfect. We may not always see it or understand it in the moment, but God's timing is never late. And it is never early. It is always right on time. In the Bible, we see many examples of people who had to wait for God's perfect timing. The story of Abraham and Sarah is one such example. God had promised them a child, but they had to wait for many years before the promise was fulfilled. They grew impatient and tried to make things happen on their own, but God's plan didn't unfold until the right time. When Isaac was born, it was clear that it was God's perfect timing. It was a reminder that God's timing is not based on our desires or impatience. It is based on His perfect wisdom and understanding of what is best for us. Similarly, in the life of David, we see a man who was anointed to be king as a young boy, but had to wait many years before he actually took the throne. During this time, he faced numerous challenges, including being pursued by King Saul, living in exile, and enduring many hardships. David could have tried to force things to happen on his own, but he trusted God's timing, and in the end, he became king at the appointed time. David's story shows us that God's plan unfolds in His perfect time, not according to our impatience or what we think should happen. Waiting on God's timing is not easy. It can be frustrating, especially when we have desires and goals that seem to be on hold or delayed indefinitely. We can feel as though we are stuck in a season of waiting with no clear direction or answer. But in those moments, we must remember that waiting is not wasted time. In fact, waiting is one of the most important aspects of the Christian journey. During times of waiting, God is working in us. He is refining our character, strengthening our faith, and preparing us for the future He has planned for us. He uses waiting to teach us patience, to deepen our dependence on Him, and to help us grow in areas of our lives that need refinement. While we may be focused on the external circumstances and the delays, God is focused on the work He is doing within us. Trusting in God's timing also involves learning to surrender our own agendas. We often have our own plans and desires for how we think things should unfold, and we can become frustrated when things don't go according to our own timeline. But God's plan is far greater than ours. He sees the bigger picture, and He knows what is best for us. Surrendering our desires and trusting God's plan is an act of faith that allows us to align ourselves with His perfect will. It's about acknowledging that we don't have all the answers and that God's timing and plan are far better than anything we could orchestrate ourselves. The challenge of waiting and trusting in God's timing is that it requires us to give up control. We like to be in control of our own lives, making decisions and setting goals. But waiting on God means relinquishing that control and allowing God to be in charge. This is a difficult lesson for many of us to learn, but it is an essential one. Trusting God's timing means trusting that He knows exactly when to move, when to act, and when to hold back. It means being content in the waiting, knowing that God is at work behind the scenes, even when we can't see it. In addition to surrendering our own agendas, trusting God's timing also means being willing to be patient and to wait on Him. Patience is a fruit of the Spirit, and it is something that God cultivates in us over time. We are not born with perfect patience, and we cannot develop it on our own. It is something that God works in us as we trust Him and wait on His timing. In James 5:7-8, we are encouraged to be patient then, brothers and sisters, until the Lord's coming. See how the farmer waits for the land to yield its valuable crop, patiently waiting for the autumn and spring rains. You too, be patient and stand firm, because the Lord's coming is near. This passage reminds us that waiting patiently for God's timing is not only a matter of trusting His plan, but also a matter of preparing for the harvest that is to come. Just as a farmer waits for the right season to reap the harvest, we too must wait for God to bring about the right season in our lives. Another aspect of trusting God's timing is recognizing that there is purpose in every season. Sometimes we focus so much on what we want to happen in the future that we miss the purpose of the present. God uses every season of our lives for His glory and our good. The waiting seasons are not wasted. They are times when God is preparing us, teaching us, and growing us in ways that we may not fully understand at the time. Ecclesiastes 3:1 says, "There is a time for everything and a season for every activity under the heavens." This verse reminds us that everything has a purpose, even the waiting. When we trust in God's timing, we are acknowledging that He knows exactly what we need and when we need it, and that every season has value in His plan. When we are tempted to grow weary or frustrated in the waiting, it helps to reflect on the promises of God. He promises that He will never leave us or forsake us, and that His plans for us are good, Jeremiah 29:11. He promises to be our strength in times of weakness and to give us peace that surpasses understanding, Philippians 4:7. These promises are reminders that God is with us in the waiting and that He is faithful to fulfill His promises at the right time. As we reflect on God's faithfulness, we can be encouraged to keep trusting His timing even when it seems like nothing is happening. The truth is that God's timing often looks different from ours, but it is always perfect. We may want things to happen quickly, but God's plan for us unfolds in His perfect time. And that timing is always for our benefit. Trusting in God's timing is an act of faith that requires patience, surrender, and a willingness to trust that God is working all things together for our good. Even in the waiting, God is faithful, and His timing is always right. Throughout this journey, we have explored the powerful and profound truth that God's plan for our lives is greater than anything we can imagine, and that trusting in His guidance, His timing, and His purpose for us is not only essential but transformative. The challenges we face, the decisions we make, and the moments of uncertainty are all part of a greater divine story that God is writing. Our job is not to control the narrative, but to surrender ourselves to the one who holds the pen, trusting that His plan will unfold with precision and perfection, even when it seems unclear. In a world that often encourages self-reliance and immediate results, trusting God's plan challenges our natural tendencies. It pushes us to let go of our need for control and to believe in something beyond ourselves. The fact that God's plan for our lives is greater than our own is not just an abstract idea, it's a fundamental truth that shapes how we live, how we make decisions, and how we view the world. God's plan, though unseen at times, is always working for our good. The very essence of faith is trusting that God is good, even when things seem difficult or we feel lost. It's about believing that the unseen work is just as powerful as the visible outcomes. We may not always see the immediate effects of our choices or the direction we are headed, but every step taken in faith is part of His perfect orchestration. Our part is to walk forward with trust, even in the moments of doubt. When we trust in God's guidance, we choose to surrender our own understanding and lean into His wisdom. As the scripture says, trust in the Lord with all your heart and lean not on your own understanding, Proverbs 3:5. The challenge of this is that it forces us to confront our own limitations and insecurities. We are not always able to see the big picture, and our human perception is clouded by emotion, fear, or impatience. But God sees everything from a higher vantage point. His vision is infinite, and His knowledge is perfect. When we choose to trust His guidance, we acknowledge that we are limited in our understanding and that only through Him can we navigate the complexities of life. Our ability to trust God's guidance often requires that we let go of our own agenda and be open to His leading. God's plan might not always align with our expectations, and that can be hard to accept. We may face moments of frustration when things do not happen the way we want or in the time frame we prefer. It is easy to get discouraged when the answers don't come immediately, but this is precisely where our faith is tested. Waiting on God's timing is an act of surrender. It is choosing to trust that His plan is not just for our benefit in the moment, but for the long-term good He desires to bring about in our lives. The waiting periods are never wasted, even if we don't understand their purpose right away. In every season, God is working on us, refining us, and preparing us for what lies ahead. The truth is that our faith in God's timing is often what sustains us through the hardest seasons of life. When we trust in His timing, we can find peace amidst uncertainty. We can look back on our journey and recognize how His timing was perfect, even when we didn't understand it. It takes faith to trust that God is not withholding good from us, but is preparing us for the good He has in store. His delays are not denials. They are part of the process of shaping us into the people we are meant to be. Every moment of waiting, every moment of struggle, and every moment of uncertainty is part of His plan to grow our trust and our reliance on Him. We don't have to have all the answers or know every step ahead. We just have to trust that the one leading us does. One of the most beautiful aspects of trusting in God's plan is that it takes the burden of control off our shoulders. It frees us from the weight of having to figure everything out, make every decision on our own, and determine the outcome of every situation. God already knows the end from the beginning. His purpose for us is not just about what we do, but about who we become. Our character, our strength, and our ability to handle life's challenges are shaped in the moments when we surrender our control and allow God to lead. He is more concerned with shaping our hearts than with simply meeting our expectations. His love for us is constant, and His plan for us is filled with hope and promise. When we trust in that, we are able to release the need to control every outcome and allow Him to do the work that only He can do. The journey of trusting God's plan and timing is not a one-time decision, but a daily practice. Every day we must choose to trust that God knows what He is doing, even when it feels like we are in the dark. This trust is not passive, it's an active decision to move forward with faith, even in the face of uncertainty. It's about choosing to trust God when the path is unclear, and even when it seems that the doors we've prayed for haven't opened. The act of trusting God means walking forward in faith, knowing that He will never leave us or forsake us. His guidance may not always come in the way we expect, but it is always present, always faithful, and always leading us toward the plan He has prepared for us. One of the most important aspects of trusting God's plan is understanding that His ways are higher than ours. We may not always understand why things happen the way they do, but we can trust that He has a purpose. There are times when life doesn't make sense, when pain and hardship cloud our vision, and when the answers we seek seem far away. In those moments, we are called to trust that God's ways are not bound by our limited understanding. He sees the full picture, and He is working all things together for our good. Even when it seems like nothing is happening, He is still at work behind the scenes, orchestrating the details of our lives with precision. The ultimate reward of trusting God's plan is the peace that comes from knowing that we are walking in His will. We may not always know where we are going, but we know who is leading us. When we trust God, we can rest in the knowledge that His plan for us is good, even when we can't see the end result. His guidance, His timing, and His purpose are trustworthy. Our role is to walk in obedience, to trust His leading, and to have faith that He is always with us, always guiding us, and always working for our good. As we conclude this reflection on trusting in God's plan, let us remember that His plan is far greater than anything we could have imagined for ourselves. The road may be winding and the waiting may be long, but we can have confidence that God is at work. He is faithful to lead us, faithful to provide for us, and faithful to fulfill His promises. Our job is to trust Him every step of the way, knowing that He is faithful and will always bring His perfect plan to fruition. Trusting in God's plan is not about having all the answers. It's about walking forward in faith, knowing that He is leading us with love, wisdom, and an everlasting purpose. So rise up, step boldly into your calling. Trust the God who created the stars and knows your name. Trust that He's not just working for you, He's working through you. And when you do that, my friends, you'll see that His plan isn't just powerful, it's life-changing. God's plan for you is unstoppable. All you have to do is believe it and walk in it. Amen.